Listen to me, and listen close, because I don't know how much time I have left to say this before the weight of it just crushes the breath right out of my lungs. I'm talking to you right now, not the person sitting next to you, not the ghost of who you used to be, but you. You need to hear this. You need to hear it like your life depends on it, because honestly, it does. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 42 years old. I've spent the last 15 years managing a retail outlet in Dayton, Ohio, and I've lived the kind of life most of you would call good enough. I went to church on Easter, I paid my taxes, and I tried to be a decent mother to my 2 kids. But good enough is a lie that the devil whispers in your ear to keep you comfortable while the floor is rotting out from under your feet. I'm shaken. I'm broken. I haven't slept a full hour since that Tuesday night in November, and every time I close my eyes, I see that silver wing and the fire that didn't come from jet fuel. I was on flight 777, a red-eye from Los Angeles heading back home to Columbus. It was supposed to be a routine trip. I'd been out west for a corporate conference, lots of talk about growth and revenue and things that don't mean a lick when you're staring into the eyes of eternity. Before I go any further, I need to know who I'm talking to. I need to feel your presence in this darkness with me. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a quiet house in Pennsylvania? Are you pulling a double shift in a hospital in Florida? Please, just leave your city and your state in the comments. I need to know how far this warning is reaching, because what I saw up there at 30,000 feet wasn't just for me. It was a message for every single one of us who thinks we have more time. It was a message for the comfortable and the lukewarm. Don't ignore this. Please. The flight was half empty. You know that eerie feeling a red-eye has, the cabin lights dimmed to that strange, sickly blue, the low hum of the engines vibrating in your teeth, the smell of stale coffee and recycled air. Everyone around me was a shadow. To my left, there was a man in a business suit, his head tilted back, snoring softly. Across the aisle, a young woman was buried in her phone, the light from the screen reflecting in her eyes like she was possessed by whatever she was scrolling through. We were all so disconnected. So safe. We thought the laws of physics and the skill of the pilots were the only things holding us up. We forgot that we are held in the palm of a God we've spent our whole lives trying to ignore. I was staring out the window, looking at the carpet of clouds below us. It was a moonless night, just an infinite stretch of black. I was thinking about my daughter, Becca. We'd had a fight before I left. A stupid fight about her grades and the crowd she was hanging out with, but I'd been so sharp with her. I'd been so full of pride. I sat there in seat 14A, thinking I was so right, so justified in my anger. I didn't know that in a matter of minutes, the petty grievances of my life would be burned away by a light that no human I was ever meant to behold. It started with a vibration. Not turbulence, not the bumpy air we're all used to. This was different. It felt like a heartbeat. A deep, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the very metal of the plane. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The businessman kept snoring. The girl kept scrolling. But the air in the cabin, it changed. It got heavy. It felt like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly tripled. It became hard to breathe, like the oxygen was being replaced by something thicker, something more ancient. That's when I looked out the window again. At first, I thought it was a reflection. A trick of the light. There was a glow coming from the right engine, the big Rolls-Royce turbine hanging off the wing. It wasn't the orange glow of a fire. It was white. A white so bright it felt like it was piercing through my retinas and into my very soul. And then, I saw them. Folks, I am a sane woman. I am a mother. I am a taxpayer. I don't see things. But I am telling you, as God is my witness, there were figures standing on the wing of that plane. They didn't have shadows. They didn't have features like you or me. They were tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and they were draped in what looked like robes woven out of lightning. But it was their hands, they were holding swords. Long, curved blades that weren't made of steel. They were made of pure, dancing flame. The fire was white and blue, and it didn't flicker, it roared with a sound I could hear even through the pressurized glass. There were 3 of them. They were standing around the engine housing like mechanics on a shop floor, but there was no rush in their movements. They moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. I watched, paralyzed, my breath hitching in my throat, as the first one raised his flaming sword and drove it deep into the top of the engine casing. There was no explosion. There was no scream of tearing metal. The sword went through that reinforced alloy like a hot knife through a stick of butter. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up and tell the flight attendant, to wake up the snoring man, to do something. But I couldn't move. It was like I was pinned to my seat by an invisible hand. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. I watched as the second figure reached into the engine with hands that looked like molten gold. He began to pull. He was pulling out the heavy titanium fan blades, one by one. He wasn't breaking them, he was unmaking them. He was dismantling the very thing that was keeping us in the sky, and he was doing it with a look of absolute, terrifying serenity. I realized then that they weren't there to cause an accident. They weren't demons trying to crash the plane. No, this was something much worse. This was a judicial act. This was a dismantling. It felt like I was watching the gears of the universe being pulled apart because the time for them to run had finally expired. The third one, he turned. He didn't have a face, not really. Just a brilliance where a face should be, eyes that looked like twin suns burning in the depths of a dark sea. He looked right through the window. He looked right at me. And in that moment, every sin I had ever committed, every lie I'd told, every time I'd taken the name of the Lord in vain, every time I'd turned my back on someone in need, it all came rushing back. It wasn't a memory, it was a weight. I felt the crushing reality of my own rebellion against a holy God. I wasn't Sarah the good mother anymore. I was Sarah the sinner, standing on the brink of an abyss, watching the only thing I trusted, man-made technology, being stripped away by the agents of the Almighty. Listen up, a voice said. It didn't come from the intercom. It didn't come from the person next to me. It echoed inside my skull, vibrating in my marrow. The pillars of your world are falling. What will you hold on to when the sky departs like a scroll? The businessman next to me suddenly jerked awake. He gasped, clutching his chest. Do you feel that? He whispered, his voice trembling. He wasn't looking out the window. He was looking at the ceiling, his eyes wide with a primal fear. The air, it's gone cold. Why is it so cold? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't take my eyes off the wing. The angels, and that's what they were, though not the soft, winged babies you see on Christmas cards, had completely stripped the outer casing of the engine. The internal components were exposed, glowing red-hot under the touch of those flaming swords. They were cutting the fuel lines, but the fuel wasn't spilling. It was evaporating into a golden mist that trailed behind the plane like a funeral shroud. I looked at the girl across the aisle. She was still staring at her phone, but she was crying. Silent, heavy tears were streaming down her face, hitting the screen of her device. She didn't know why she was crying. She couldn't see the executioners on the wing. But her spirit knew. Her soul could feel the approach of the end. We are all like that, aren't we? We feel the darkness closing in, we feel the wrongness of this world, the rot in our culture, the hollowness in our chests, but we just keep scrolling. We keep sleeping. We keep pretending the engines aren't being dismantled right outside our window. The plane began to tilt. It wasn't a sharp drop, but a slow, sickening roll to the right. The engine on that side was no longer producing thrust. I could see the fan blades, the ones that hadn't been pulled out, slowing down, glowing with a ghostly light. One of the angels stepped toward the fuselage. He walked on the air as if it were solid ground. He approached the window where I sat, and he raised his flaming sword. I saw the tip of the blade touch the glass. I expected it to shatter. I expected the decompression to suck us all out into the freezing night. But the glass didn't break. It started to melt, but not outward. It melted inward, the heat radiating off the blade smelling like ozone and incense. I could feel the singe on my eyebrows. I could feel the skin on my face tightening from the sheer intensity of the holiness standing inches away from me. Sarah Miller, the voice boomed again, louder this time, shaking my very DNA. You have built your house upon the sand. The tide has come. The wind has blown. Do you think your decency will save you from the fire? Do you think your goodness is a shield against the truth? I fell out of my seat. I collapsed into the aisle, sobbing. The other passengers were waking up now. The cabin was filled with the sound of confused murmurs, then gasps, then the first high-pitched screams of terror. The plane was shuddering violently. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like yellow umbilical cords from a dying mother. But I knew those masks wouldn't help. There was no air left in the world that could save us. I looked up from the floor, and through the gap between the seats, I saw the angel's sword pass through the wall of the plane. It sliced through the overhead bins, through the wiring, through the luggage. It wasn't destroying the plane to kill us. It was destroying the plane to show us that we were already dead. We were already lost. We had been flying on a ghost ship for years, fueled by our own delusions, and now the reality of the spiritual realm was breaking through the thin veneer of our physical world. Buddy, you need to hear this, I whispered to the businessman who was now praying frantically to a God he clearly hadn't spoken to in decades. It's not the engine. It's not the plane. It's him. He's here. The man looked at me, his face pale as a sheet. Who? Who's here? The one we ignored, I said. And then, the entire right wing, the whole thing, ignited. Not in a fireball of gasoline, but in a pillar of celestial flame that stretched up toward the stars. The angels stood in the center of the fire, their swords raised high, and as the plane began its final, screaming descent toward the dark earth of the Midwest, I realized that I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of meeting the one who was pulling the world apart. I was afraid of the light. I'm telling you this because I survived. I shouldn't have, but I did. And the reason I'm here, the reason I'm shaking and crying into this microphone, is because the story doesn't end with the crash. It starts there. It starts with what happened when the fire finally reached the cabin. Folks, don't ignore this. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't a tall tale. This is a warning. If you're sitting there thinking you have time to get right with God, if you think you can wait until tomorrow to repent, you're looking out the window of a plane whose engines are already gone. You just haven't noticed the angels yet. I need to tell you what happened next. I need to tell you what the third angel said when he stepped through the wall of the plane and stood over me in the aisle. But I need to catch my breath. I need to know you're still with me. I'm talking to you right now because I need you to understand that the world isn't what you think it is. We walk around in this little bubble of safety, thinking that as long as we have a 401k and a clean driving record, we're okay. But I saw the bubble pop. I saw the curtain ripped back, and what was behind it, it's been burning in my mind every second of every day since. I'm telling you this because I'm haunted. I'm a broken woman, and I'm trying to hand you a life jacket before you hit the water. Before I tell you what that angel said, I need to say something else. You need to hit that subscribe button and you need to hit it right now. I'm not saying that for me. I don't want the fame, I don't want the attention, I'd give anything to go back to being the anonymous woman in 14A who didn't know the truth. But this message is being suppressed. People don't want to hear about judgment. They don't want to hear about the end. If you don't subscribe, you might never find your way back to this warning, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss where this ends. You have to stay with me until the very last word of this confession, because the revelation at the end of this flight is the only thing that might save your soul. Don't click away. Don't think you can come back to this later. Tomorrow isn't promised to anyone, not to me, and definitely not to you. The angel didn't walk, he was. He was just suddenly there, occupying the space where the air used to be. The businessman, Harold, I found out his name later from the manifest, he was hyperventilating, his face a shade of gray that I've only seen on the dead. He was clutching his leather briefcase like it was a holy relic, but when that angel stepped into the aisle, the leather started to smoke. It started to curl and blacken, not from a fire, but from the sheer weight of the holiness in the room. All those papers, all those contracts and, important, documents Harold had spent his life chasing, they were turning to ash right in his lap. The angel's sword was still dripping with that white fire. A drop of it fell onto the carpet of the aisle, and it didn't burn a hole, it erased the carpet. It left a void, a patch of nothingness that looked like a hole in the fabric of reality. I stared at it, and for the first time in my life, I understood what holy really meant. It's not a soft, fuzzy feeling. It's not a stained glass window. It's a consuming fire that cannot coexist with anything that isn't pure. And folks, I realized right then that there wasn't a single pure thing in that entire cabin. Not the plane, not the people, and definitely not me. The girl across the aisle, Ashley, she dropped her phone. It clattered to the floor, the screen finally dark, and she just looked up at the angel with this expression of such profound regret that it broke my heart. She looked like she'd spent her whole life looking for a love that didn't exist, and now she was staring at the only love that ever mattered, and she was terrified of it. We all were. We were terrified because we were naked. Not physically, but our souls were stripped of every excuse, every rationalization, at least I'm not as bad as that guy, thought we'd ever use to sleep at night. The angel looked at me. He didn't have eyes in the way we do, but I felt his gaze like a physical blow to my chest. It felt like he was reaching into my ribcage and pulling out every secret I'd ever buried. He saw the time I lied to my husband about the money. He saw the time I'd walked past that homeless man in Dayton and pretended to be on my phone so I wouldn't have to acknowledge his existence. He saw the pride I carried like a shield, the way I thought I was better than the people in the trailers on the edge of town. He saw it all. The engine is gone, Sarah, the angel said. The voice didn't sound like a man. It sounded like 1,000 waterfalls, like the grinding of tectonic plates, like the first word ever spoken at the dawn of creation. The power of man has failed. The wisdom of the world has reached its limit. You are falling. Why are you still holding on to the wreckage? I couldn't speak. My mouth was like a desert. I looked at the ceiling of the plane, and it was becoming transparent. I could see the stars, but they weren't just points of light anymore. They were like eyes, billions of them, watching the tragedy of Flight 777. The plane was banking hard now, the nose dipping toward the dark earth of America below. I could see the lights of a city, maybe it was Indianapolis, maybe it was St. Louis, twinkling like jewels on a velvet cloth. Thousands of people down there were sleeping, or watching TV, or arguing, or making plans for a Wednesday they might never see. They had no idea that a few miles above them, the supernatural was tearing through the physical. Harold grabbed my arm. His grip was so tight I knew I'd have bruises. Is this hell? He screamed. His voice was raw, a jagged edge of pure panic. Are we in hell? The angel turned his head toward Harold. The fire from his sword flared up, illuminating the cabin in a blinding, terrifying white. Hell is not a place you fall into, the angel said, and the sadness in his voice was more frightening than the anger. Hell is a place you build for yourself, brick by brick, rejection by rejection. You are not in hell, Harold. You are in the moment of truth. And the truth is, you never loved anything but yourself. Harold let go of my arm and slumped back. He started to wail, a low, guttural sound that didn't even sound human. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd spent 60 years building a kingdom of dust. And I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't much better. I had my Christian labels, I had my church attendance, but did I have him? Did I know the one whose angels were currently dismantling my life? Or was I just using God as a cosmic insurance policy? The plane shuddered, a massive, bone-jarring jolt that sent the overhead bins flying open. Suitcases and bags rained down on us, the physical weight of our worldly possessions literally crushing us as we fell. A heavy suitcase hit the floor next to me, bursting open and spilling out clothes, a hairdryer, a Bible. I saw that Bible, it was mine. It was small, leather-bound, and the pages were crisp because I rarely opened it. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, but as my hand got close, the angel's sword passed over it. The Bible didn't burn. It began to glow. It shone with a light that matched the angel's robes. And suddenly, I could see words written in the air, floating above the pages. They were verses I'd heard 1,000 times but never listened to. Because you are lukewarm, and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. The words weren't on the page, they were a judgment written in the very atmosphere of the falling plane. Folks, you need to hear this, I whispered, though my voice was barely a croak. We're not falling because of a mechanical failure. We're falling because we've reached the end of the patience of God. I looked out the window again. The other wing, the left one, was now being swarmed by more of those beings. I saw 5, 6, maybe 10 of them. They were like a white fire consuming the metal. They were stripping the rivets, peeling back the aluminum skin of the wing as if it were parchment. They were doing it with such intent, such purpose. It wasn't chaos. It was a calculated deconstruction. It was as if the plane represented the entire civilization of man, our pride, our technology, our independence from the Creator, and they were systematically proving how fragile it all was. The pilot's voice came over the intercom then. It wasn't the calm, professional voice you expect. It was a man in total, shivering terror. Mayday, Mayday, we've lost both engines, we've lost all electrical. Something is, oh God, something is outside the cockpit window. It's not birds. Oh Jesus, help us. The intercom cut out with a burst of static that sounded like a scream. The cabin pressure was dropping. The air was getting thin and bitterly cold, but the heat from the angels kept us from freezing. It was a strange, agonizing paradox, the cold of death and the heat of holiness. Ashley, the girl across the aisle, reached out her hand toward me. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. She was looking at the Bible on the floor. Is it true? She sobbed, the wind whipping her hair around her face. Is what they say about him true? Is there really a way out of this? I looked at her, and then I looked at the angel standing in the aisle. He was watching me, waiting. It felt like the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would say to this dying girl in the middle of a falling plane. My heart was breaking. I realized that all those years I'd spent being a good person, I'd never once told anyone about the actual mercy of Jesus. I'd been too embarrassed. Too worried about what people would think. And now, as we were screaming toward the ground at 500 miles an hour, I was the only one who could tell her. Yes, I said, and for the first time, my voice was strong. I felt a surge of something that wasn't fear, it was a desperate, burning urgency. It's true, Ashley. There is a name. There is a way. But you have to let go of everything else. You have to let go of yourself. The angel raised his sword. The blade was now so bright I had to shield my eyes. The entire front of the cabin, the cockpit door, the first-class galley, it all just vanished. Not exploded. Just ceased to be. I could see the two pilots. They weren't flying the plane anymore. They were on their knees on the floor of the cockpit, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the blinding light that was pouring in through the shattered windshield. We were over the fields now. I could see the dark squares of farmland, the tiny veins of roads, the occasional flicker of a farmhouse porch light. We were so close to the ground. The wind was a deafening roar, a symphony of destruction. The plane was breaking apart in midair. The tail section was gone. The wings were mere skeletons of glowing wire. I grabbed Ashley's hand. I grabbed Harold's hand. We were a chain of terrified, broken people huddled in the middle of a dissolving machine. The angel stepped closer. He was standing right over us now, his presence so intense it felt like my skin was going to turn into light itself. The choice is not between life and death, the angel said, and his voice was the last thing I heard before the world turned into a silent, white explosion. The choice is between the shadow and the substance. What did you choose, Sarah Miller? Everything went white. Not the white of a flashbulb, but a white that had depth, a white that had weight. I felt myself being pulled out of my seat, pulled out of the plane, pulled out of time itself. I wasn't falling anymore. I was being weighed. And folks, you have no idea how heavy your sins are until you're being weighed in a room made of pure light. I need to tell you what I saw when I opened my eyes in that light. I need to tell you about the throne. But most of all, I need to tell you about the man who was standing between me and the fire. You think you know this story? You don't. You haven't heard the most terrifying part yet. Stay with me. Don't you dare turn this off. When the world went white, I thought that was it. I thought that was the moment of impact, the moment the fuselage finally succumbed to the ground and my life was extinguished like a candle in a gale. But there was no impact. There was no sound of crushing metal or the smell of burning jet fuel. Instead, there was a silence so absolute it felt like it was ringing in my ears. I wasn't in my seat anymore. I wasn't holding Ashley's hand. I wasn't even Sarah Miller, the retail manager from Dayton, anymore. I was just a soul. A naked, shivering, terrified consciousness stripped of every title and every possession I'd ever used to define myself. I'm telling you this right now because you need to understand that the you that you see in the mirror every morning, the one you spend so much money dressing up, the one you feed and protect and worry about, that's just a costume. It's a shell. And when that shell is cracked open, what's inside is the only thing that matters. And buddy, I'm telling you, what was inside me was a mess. It was a dark, tangled knot of pride and self-righteousness. I was standing, or hovering, I don't even know, in a space that had no floor and no ceiling. It was just an endless expanse of that terrifying, holy light. It wasn't heavenly, in the way we think of it, like a peaceful park or a cloud. It was a courtroom. But there were no lawyers. There were no witnesses. The light itself was the witness. It was as if the holiness of God was a physical force, like gravity, and it was pressing down on me, demanding that I account for every second of the 42 years I'd spent on that earth. I felt the weight of my life. It didn't feel like a series of memories, it felt like a heavy, leaden garment. Every time I'd been cruel to my husband, every time I'd judged a woman at the grocery store for her messy kids or her tired eyes, every time I'd sat in a church pew and sang hymns while my heart was 1,000 miles away, thinking about what I was going to cook for Sunday dinner or how I could get ahead at work, it was all there. It was all laid bare. Holy, 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 a voice echoed. It didn't come from a throat. It came from the light itself. And every time that word, holy, echoed, I felt like I was being burned. Not by a fire that destroys, but by a fire that reveals. I realized in that moment that my goodness was nothing. It was like trying to use a dirty rag to clean a diamond. My good life in Ohio was a farce. I had lived for Sarah. I had built a kingdom of one, and I was the only person on the throne. I saw them then. The angels from the plane. They were there, but they weren't dismantling an engine anymore. They were standing in a circle, and their swords were no longer flaming, they were shimmering with a cold, blue light that looked like frozen lightning. They were the guardians of the truth. And in the center of that circle, there was a great white throne. I couldn't look at it. I tried, but the sheer power radiating from it was like trying to stare into the surface of the sun from an inch away. I fell on my face. I didn't just kneel, I collapsed. I wanted the earth to swallow me up, but there was no earth. There was only the presence. And I knew, with a certainty that reached into the very marrow of my spiritual being, that I was lost. I was a good person who was going to spend eternity apart from God because I had never actually known him. I had used his name, I had worn his cross around my neck, but I had never let him be the Lord of my life. I was one of those people Jesus talked about, the ones who say, Lord, Lord, but he says, I never knew you. I started to scream. But it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of realization. I didn't know. I cried out into the light. I thought I was okay. I thought I was a good person. And the voice, the one that sounded like 1,000 waterfalls, answered me. You were told. The heavens declared the glory. The word was given. Your own conscience bore witness. You chose the shadow, Sarah Miller. You chose the reflection instead of the sun. I felt myself starting to drift. It felt like I was being pulled away from the light, back toward a darkness that was so thick it felt like liquid. I knew where I was going. I knew what was at the end of that descent. It wasn't a scary place with little red men, it was the outer darkness. It was the place where God isn't. It was the place where you are left alone with yourself, your pride, your bitterness, your regret, forever. I saw the faces of the people on the plane. I saw Harold, the businessman. I saw him drifting in that same darkness, still clutching his invisible briefcase, his face frozen in a mask of eternal realization. I saw Ashley, the young girl, her eyes wide with a terror that would never end. I felt the cold. The same cold that had been in the cabin of Flight 777 was now inside my soul. I was falling again, but this time there was no plane. There was just the void. Jesus! I screamed. I hadn't said that name in years, not really. I'd used it as an exclamation. I'd used it as a period at the end of a formal prayer. But I hadn't called on him. Not from the depths of my soul. Not as a drowning woman calls for a lifeline. Jesus, help me. Save me. I'm a sinner. I'm nothing. Please, don't let me go into the dark. The falling stopped. It didn't just slow down. It stopped instantly. The darkness didn't recede, it was shattered. A hand reached into the void, a hand that looked like it was made of the same light as the throne, but it was different. It was warm. It was human. And as that hand grabbed mine, I saw the mark. Right there in the center of the wrist. A jagged, circular scar that looked like it had been carved by an iron spike. The heat that came from that hand, folks, I can't even describe it. It wasn't the heat that singes your skin. It was the heat of a father holding his child after a nightmare. It was the heat of home. It was the heat of a love so powerful that it makes the sun look like a flickering match. He pulled me up. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there between me and the throne. He stood between me and the judgment. He was the shield. He was the advocate. He was the one who had taken the dismantling that I deserved. I looked at his back, and I could see the marks there, too. He was covered in the evidence of what it cost to reach into the darkness and pull someone like me out. She is mine, he said. The voice wasn't a roar this time. It was a whisper, but that whisper carried more authority than the angels' swords or the thundering of the light. Her name is written. Not because of her works, which are as filthy rags, but because of my blood, which is pure. I looked down at myself, and I wasn't wearing the heavy, leaden garment of my sins anymore. I was covered in a robe that was as white as the angel's lightning, but soft as silk. I realized then that I hadn't earned that robe. I hadn't bought it. I hadn't even asked for it until the very last second of my life. It was a gift. A terrifying, beautiful, unmerited gift. But then, he turned around. I thought I knew what Jesus looked like. I'd seen the paintings. I'd seen the movies. But those are just cartoons compared to the reality. His eyes, they were like two deep wells of ancient fire. They saw everything I was, and they loved me anyway, but they didn't tolerate the darkness. They burned it away. He looked at me, and I felt like I was being reborn in a single second. Sarah, he said. Why did you wait until the engines were gone? The question wasn't an accusation. It was a grief. It was the sound of a heart that had been breaking for 42 years while I ignored him. You lived your life as if the plane would never crash, he said. You lived as if the earth was your home. But the earth is a vapor. The plane is a shadow. Only the spirit is real. I wanted to stay there forever. I wanted to just sit at his feet and never look back at the world again. But he shook his head. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it felt like a mountain of peace. It is not your time, he whispered. Not yet. You have seen what lies behind the curtain. You have seen the dismantling. Now, you must go back and tell them. Tell them that the flight is ending. Tell them that the angels are already on the wings. Tell them that the only thing holding them up is my mercy, and that mercy has a limit. I can't go back. I sobbed, clutching his robe. They won't believe me. They'll think I'm crazy. They'll think it was just a dream or the lack of oxygen. Some will, he said, and a shadow of sorrow passed over his face. But some will hear. Some will look out their own windows and see the fire. Some will realize that their goodness is a lie before it's too late. Go, Sarah. Tell them about the red eye. Tell them about Flight 777. The light began to swirl. The throne, the angels, the beautiful, terrifying man, they all started to blur into a vortex of color and sound. I felt the wind again. I felt the cold. I felt the crushing pressure of the atmosphere. I was being shoved back into my body, back into the metal tube, back into the screaming chaos of a plane that was falling out of the sky. I'm talking to you right now because I remember every second of it. I remember the feeling of my soul being squeezed back into my skin. I remember the smell of the ozone and the sound of the metal groaning as the air tried to rip it apart. But most of all, I remember the look in his eyes. He's not a storybook character, folks. He's not a religious figure to be put on a shelf. He is the reality that everything else is built on, and we are ignoring him at our own peril. I'm telling you this because I'm haunted by what I saw next. When I opened my physical eyes back in that cabin, the angels weren't gone. They were still there. But they weren't dismantling the engines anymore. They were doing something much, much worse. They were preparing for the impact. Listen up, because what I saw in those final seconds before we hit the ground, it's the reason I can't sleep. It's the reason I'm crying. It's the reason you need to listen to part 4 of this story. Because the crash wasn't the end. The crash was where the real battle began. You need to hear this. Buddy, you need to hear this. Don't you dare walk away from this screen. The transition back into my body felt like being slammed into a wall of ice and lead. 1 second, I was in the presence of the light, wrapped in a peace that defies every human word, and the next, I was back in the screaming metal tomb of Flight 777. The air was a roar of freezing wind and the high-pitched whistle of air escaping through the cracks in the fuselage. The smell, it was a mixture of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and that primal, copper scent of pure, unadulterated fear. I'm talking to you right now because I need you to understand that I didn't want to come back. I didn't want to leave his side. But I was shoved back into this world of shadows with a mission, and that mission is you. Before I tell you what I saw in those final 2 minutes of the descent, I have to give you a warning. Folks, don't ignore what I'm about to say. You need to hit that subscribe button right now. I'm not asking for me, I'm asking because there are forces in this world that do not want this message to get out. They want you distracted by the news, by your phone, by the petty dramas of your life until the moment your own engines fail. If you don't stay until the very end of this story, you are walking away from the most important truth you will ever hear. This isn't just a story about a plane crash. It's a map of the territory we are all about to enter. Stay with me. Please, for the sake of your own soul, stay till the end. The cabin was a nightmare. The emergency lights were flickering, a jagged, strobe-like pulsing that made the chaos look like a series of disconnected, terrifying photographs. 1 second, I saw a suitcase fly across the aisle. The next, I saw the oxygen masks dancing like yellow ghosts in the wind. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the debris. It was the angels. They were inside the cabin now. They weren't the beautiful, comforting figures from the throne room. They were the warriors I'd seen on the wings, but their presence inside the confined space of the plane was overwhelming. They were too tall for the cabin, their heads brushing against the overhead compartments, their robes of lightning casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. They weren't looking at the luggage. They weren't looking at the structural failure of the plane. They were looking at the people. I saw an angel standing directly over Harold, the businessman. Harold was still in his seat, but his seatbelt had snapped, and he was white-knuckling the armrests, his eyes rolling back in his head as he screamed a prayer that sounded more like a bargain. The angel standing over him had his sword drawn, not the white fire of dismantling, but a cold, heavy blade that looked like it was forged from the vacuum of space. The angel wasn't attacking him. He was waiting. He was like a sentry at a gate, and Harold was the prisoner. I realized then that these angels weren't there to save us from the crash. They were there to collect what was already decided. They were the harvesters. And as I looked down the length of the plane, I saw them standing in the aisles, one by one, like silent reapers in a field of ripening grain. Some passengers couldn't see them. They were just screaming at the floor, or clutching their loved ones. But some saw. I saw an elderly woman in row 22. She wasn't screaming. She had her eyes closed, her hands folded, and she was glowing. Not with the lightning of the angels, but with a soft, steady warmth. The angel standing near her didn't have his sword drawn. He had his hand placed gently on the back of her seat, and his expression, it was one of such profound, brotherly respect that it made me weep. Harold. I shouted over the roar of the wind. I had to unbuckle my own belt. I had to get to him. Harold, listen to me. It's not too late. Call on him. Not for your life, call on him for your soul. Harold looked at me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, blind terror. The money, he shrieked. I worked so hard. I built it all. It can't end like this. I have a meeting on Wednesday. I have a contract. He was still talking about Wednesday. We were falling at hundreds of feet per second toward the dark earth of Indiana or Ohio, and he was still talking about his contracts. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. The spiritual blindness was so thick it was like a physical shroud over his head. He couldn't see the angel. He couldn't see the fire. He could only see the loss of his things. I turned to Ashley, the girl across the aisle. She was huddled in a ball on the floor, her phone smashed beneath her. She looked up at me, and I saw the mark I'd seen in the spirit, the hunger in her eyes. "Sarah," she screamed. "The light. I saw the light when you were gone. I felt it. Is he here? Is he really here?" "He's here, Ashley." I crawled toward her, the floor of the plane tilting at a sickening 45-degree angle. The air was getting thicker as we dropped into the lower atmosphere, the pressure building in my ears like a hammer. "He's right here. Just give him your yes. Give him your life before the ground takes it." She reached out for my hand, and as our fingers locked, the angel standing over us moved. He stepped into the aisle, his massive form blocking the flickering lights. He looked down at Ashley, and for a second, I thought he was going to strike. But then, he did something that haunted me. He sheathed his sword. The sound of that cold metal sliding into the scabbard was like the closing of a tomb. "The choice is being sealed," the angel said. The voice wasn't in my head this time, it was a physical vibration that shook the entire fuselage. "The moment of the great separation is at hand." I looked out the window one last time. We had broken through the cloud cover. Below us, the world was a grid of tiny, flickering lights, towns, farms, highways where people were driving home from late shifts, listening to the radio, thinking they had 40 years of life ahead of them. They had no idea that a celestial execution was happening right above their heads. They had no idea that Flight 777 was a flaming arrow aimed at the heart of their illusions. The plane began to disintegrate in earnest. The right wing, stripped of its engine by those flaming swords, finally buckled and tore away. The sound was like 1,000 thunderclaps happening at once. The plane spiraled. We were in a flat spin, the centrifugal force pinning us against the walls of the cabin. People were being thrown like rag dolls. I saw a man in a navy blue sweater fly past me, his face a blur of red and white. He didn't even have time to scream. I held on to Ashley with everything I had. "Jesus," I prayed. "Jesus, receive her. Jesus, help us." But then, the darkness came back. Not the holy darkness of the void, but a heavy, oppressive, spiritual darkness that seemed to seep out of the very floorboards of the plane. I saw things, shapes that weren't angels. They were shadows, jagged and oily, crawling along the ceiling. They were drawn to the fear. They were drawn to the people who, like Harold, were clutching their earthly lives with white-knuckled desperation. They were like vultures circling a dying animal. I realized then that the dismantling I'd seen on the wing wasn't just a physical act. It was a spiritual one. The angels were peeling back the layers of our protection to show us what we had invited into our lives. If you lived for the shadows were there to claim you. If you lived for the light was there to catch you. It was so simple. So terrifyingly simple. "Buddy, you need to hear this," I whispered, even though no one could hear me over the screaming of the wind and the dying engines. "You are choosing your company for eternity right now. Every time you choose your pride over his mercy, you are inviting one of those shadows into your seat." The ground was coming up fast. I could see individual trees now, dark silhouettes against the snow-covered fields. I could see the reflection of the plane's fire in the windows of a farmhouse. I thought about the family inside that house. They'd hear a roar, they'd see a flash, and they'd call 911. They'd talk about the tragedy for years. But they wouldn't see the angels. They wouldn't see the shadows. They wouldn't know that row 14 was a battlefield where souls were being won and lost in the span of a heartbeat. The angel standing over me raised his hand. He wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking up, toward the sky we had just fallen from. He began to sing. It wasn't a melody I'd ever heard, it was a series of tones that seemed to harmonize with the breaking of the metal and the howling of the wind. It was a song of transition. It was a song of homegoing. And then, I saw Harold. The businessman had finally lost his grip. He was sliding down the aisle toward the gaping hole where the tail section used to be. He looked at me, and for one fleeting second, the terror was gone, replaced by a clarity that was more heartbreaking than the screaming. "I missed it," he mouthed. There was no sound, but I saw the words on his lips. "I missed it all." And then he was gone. Sucked out into the night, followed by the shadow that had been waiting for him. I closed my eyes. I pulled Ashley closer to my chest. I felt the heat of the fire, the cold of the wind, and then a sudden, jarring sensation of weightlessness. The plane had stopped spinning. We were dropping straight down. The nose was aimed directly at a frozen lake. "Folks, don't ignore this," my soul cried out. "The impact is coming for everyone. The flight is ending." I felt the angel's hand touch my head. It was the last thing I felt before the world exploded into a billion shards of ice and fire. But I'm still here. I'm still talking to you. And you need to know why. You need to know what happened when I crawled out of that wreckage and looked back at the lake. Because what I saw standing on the ice, it's the reason I'm warning you. It's the reason this story isn't over. There is one more thing. One final revelation that the angel gave me before he vanished into the morning mist. And if you don't hear it, everything I've told you so far is just a scary story. You need the truth. You need the ending. Stay with me for part 5. This is the moment of the call. This is where your flight begins. I don't know how I'm breathing. I don't know how my lungs are pulling in this freezing Indiana air when every law of physics says I should be a broken pile of bone and ash at the bottom of that lake. But I'm here. I'm standing on the edge of a jagged hole in the ice, looking at the twisted, smoking carcass of Flight 777, and I'm talking to you because the silence that followed that crash was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Listen to me. I'm talking to you right now, in your car, in your living room, in your bed where you think you're safe. Buddy, you need to hear this. The crash wasn't the end of the story. It was just the opening of the final book. When the plane hit the ice, it wasn't like the movies. There wasn't a massive orange fireball that lit up the night. It was a cold, violent, grinding sound, the sound of man's pride being crushed by the weight of the earth. I remember the impact feeling like a giant hand reached through the floor and slammed me into a different dimension. And then, for a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the ticking of cooling metal. I crawled out of a rent in the fuselage. My hands were bleeding, my coat was torn to shreds, and the snow was falling in big, heavy flakes that looked like ash. I stood up on that frozen lake, my legs shaking, and I turned around to look for Ashley. I turned around to look for anyone. But the plane was quiet. It was just a hollowed-out tube of silver and shadow. And that's when I saw them. The angels weren't on the wings anymore. They were standing on the ice, forming a circle around the wreckage. There were hundreds of them now. They weren't glowing with that blinding light anymore. They were dim, like embers in a dying fire, as if they were mourning. They were standing perfectly still, their flaming swords held point down into the ice. And in between the angels, I saw the passengers. I saw Harold. He was standing on the ice, maybe 20 feet away from me. He looked exactly like he did on the plane, but he was translucent. He was staring at his hands, hands that were empty. No briefcase. No contracts. No phone. He was looking at the angel in front of him, and the expression on Harold's face. I will see it every time I close my eyes until the day I die. It wasn't terror anymore. It was an infinite, soul-crushing grief. He looked like a man who had finally realized he'd spent his entire life buying tickets for a destination that didn't exist. The angel in front of him didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stepped aside, pointing toward the darkness beyond the edge of the lake. And Harold, he just started walking. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just walked into the blackness, his figure fading until he was nothing more than a memory of a man who loved the world more than he loved the one who made it. Then I saw Ashley. She was standing near the tail section. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of that same girl who'd been scrolling on her phone. But then she looked at the angel standing beside her. This angel was different. He reached out and touched her shoulder, and as he did, Ashley's translucent form began to brighten. She didn't walk into the darkness. She stayed in the light. She looked back at me one last time, and she smiled, a smile that felt like the first day of spring after 100-year winter, and then she was gone. She didn't fade, she ascended. I was the only physical thing left on that lake. I was the only one with blood in my veins and breath in my lungs. I fell to my knees in the snow, sobbing so hard I thought my chest would crack open. Why me? I screamed at the sky. Why did you send me back? Why am I the only one left in the wreckage? The angel who had stood over me in the aisle, the one who had sheathed his sword, walked across the ice toward me. His footsteps didn't make a sound. He stopped a few feet away, and the air around him felt like the inside of a church during a funeral, heavy, holy, and final. Sarah Miller, he said, and his voice was the sound of the end of the world. The engines were dismantled to show you the truth. The flight was crashed to show you the end. But you were spared for a purpose. You are a witness to the great separation. He pointed his hand toward the horizon, toward the lights of the cities and the towns of America. Look at them, the angel said. They are all on flight 777. They are all sitting in their seats, eating their meals, watching their screens, thinking they are moving toward a tomorrow that is guaranteed. They do not see the fire on the wings. They do not hear the dismantling of their foundations. They think the hum of the engine is the sound of safety, but it is the sound of a countdown. I looked where he pointed, and I didn't see cities anymore. I saw millions of tiny lights, each one a soul, and over every single one of them, I saw an angel with a sword. Some were waiting. Some were already moving. Folks, listen to me, I'm saying this to you now with everything I have left. The message the angel gave me on that ice, it's for you. It's the warning I was sent back to deliver. He told me to tell you that the time for good enough is over. The time for being lukewarm is a luxury you can no longer afford. Every breath you take is a mercy from a God you have pushed to the edge of his patience. The angel leaned down, his face a blinding radiance that made the snow look like diamonds. Tell them, he whispered, that the door is still open. But the hinges are weary. Tell them that the man with the scarred hands is still reaching into the void, but the void is growing. Tell them to repent. Not tomorrow. Not when they feel like it. Not after they've had their fun. Tell them to repent now, while the engines are still turning, however slowly they may be. And then, he was gone. The angels, the spirits of the passengers, the glowing swords, it all vanished into the morning mist. I was just a woman sitting in the snow next to a crashed plane in the middle of Indiana. I was found 3 hours later by a state trooper. They called it a miracle. They called me the lone survivor of Flight 777. They put my face on the news. They wanted to talk about human resilience and aviation safety. But I didn't talk about those things. I told them about the angels. I told them about the dismantling. And they looked at me with pity. They told me I had PTSD. They told me the brain does strange things when it's deprived of oxygen. But I know what I saw. And you know it, too. You can feel it in your gut right now. You can feel that vibration in the air, that thrumming that isn't a heartbeat, but a ticking clock. You look at the world around you, you look at the chaos in the streets, the rot in the culture, The emptiness in your own heart when the lights go out, and you know the engines are failing. You know the good life you've built is a plane with no wings. I'm talking to you right now. I'm pleading with you. Don't be Harold. Don't be the person who realizes the truth only when the suitcase of your life is burning in your lap. Don't wait until the ground is coming up to meet you to call on the name that saves. Jesus is real. He is the substance in a world of shadows. He is the only thing that won't burn when the angels finish their work. He is the man I saw standing between the sinner and the throne. He took the crash for you. He was dismantled so you could be made whole. But he won't force you to love him. He won't force you to choose the light. If you're listening to this, and you feel that heat in your chest, that's not a story. That's a call. That's the Holy Spirit of God reaching through your screen, through your speakers, and grabbing you by the hand. He's asking you, what are you holding on to? Is it your pride? Is it your sin? Is it your goodness? Let it go. Let it all go. Get on your knees. Right now. I don't care if you're in a truck stop or a bedroom or a kitchen. Get on your knees and confess that you are a sinner in need of a Savior. Ask Jesus to take the controls of your life. Ask him to wash you in the blood that the angel spoke of, the only thing that can write your name in the book of life. The flight is almost over, folks. The red eye is coming in for a landing, and the runway is on fire. Turn to him. Repent. Choose the light while there is still light to choose. I've delivered the message. My hands are clean. But yours? Your choice is yours alone. Don't wait until you see the angels on the wing. By then, it's too late. God bless you. And may God have mercy on your soul. Turn to Jesus today. He is waiting. But the engines are almost gone.